They seized her infant to settle what she owed, until a bone trail scout arrived at high sun saying, "Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get into the story. The sun was setting over the rugged plains of the Dakota Territory, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and red. In the distance, the soft sound of hooves pounding the earth echoed through the air as a lone rider approached a small, isolated cabin. Inside, a mother named Clara sat, her hands trembling as she held her infant close to her chest. The air inside the cabin felt stifling, thick with the tension that had been building for weeks. Her eyes darted nervously to the door, knowing that any moment, her worst fears would come true. Clara had always known this day would come, but nothing could prepare her for the agony of seeing her son taken from her. A few hours earlier, a group of outlaws, led by a man named Jake Blackjack Morrison, had arrived at her doorstep. They had come for what was owed, debts her father had left behind after years of gambling away the family fortune. But now, it was Clara who would pay the price, and the price was steep. In an instant, the outlaws had grabbed her child and threatened to harm him unless Clara agreed to settle her father's debts. She had no choice but to comply, her heart shattering as they tore her baby from her arms and rode off into the horizon, leaving her with nothing but a sense of helplessness and despair. The night had fallen cold, and Clara sat alone, rocking back and forth in her chair, unable to hold back her tears. She had never felt more powerless in her life. The outlaws were ruthless, and she knew there was no one who would come to her aid. That was, until the sound of approaching hooves pierced the silence. A shadow appeared in the doorway, and Clara looked up, her breath catching in her throat. Standing before her was a man, tall and strong, dressed in the traditional garb of a Native American warrior. His face was painted with the markings of his tribe, and his eyes were as sharp as a hawk's. He spoke with authority, his voice calm and steady as he announced, "You are not alone. I have come for what is yours." Clara's heart raced as she stood up, unsure of whether this man was a friend or another enemy. But there was something about him, something in the way he carried himself, the way he looked at her, that gave her hope. The man, a bone trail scout known for his skills as a tracker and protector, had been watching the outlaws for days. He had heard the whispers of their cruel demands and had sworn to intervene. With the knowledge of the land and the skill of a seasoned warrior, he would bring Clara's son back to her. "You don't have to fight this alone," he continued, stepping closer to her. "I know where they've taken him." Clara's eyes welled up with tears as she reached for him, her voice trembling. "Please, you have to help me. They will kill him if we don't get him back." The scout nodded solemnly, understanding the gravity of the situation. He turned toward the door, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife, ready to do whatever it took to bring Clara's child home. "We ride at dawn," he said. "Get some rest. Tomorrow, we bring him back." Clara watched him as he disappeared into the night, her heart swelling with gratitude and fear. She knew the journey ahead would be treacherous, but for the first time in weeks, she felt a flicker of hope. The scout's arrival had given her something she hadn't dared to believe in: rescue. And as the first light of day began to break through the horizon, Clara knew that the battle to save her son was just beginning. As dawn broke over the horizon, the soft rays of light barely touched the rugged landscape. Clara stood beside the scout, her hands trembling as they prepared to ride out. The air was crisp, and the ground was still damp from the cool night. She had never been more anxious or hopeful at the same time. Her son was out there, somewhere, with the ruthless outlaws who had taken him. Every minute that passed without him was a minute too long. The Bone Trail Scout, whose presence had brought her a sense of peace she never thought possible, was already mounting his horse. He was a man of few words, but his calm demeanor spoke volumes. Clara, still reeling from the events of the last few days, tightened the grip on her reins and steeled herself for the ride ahead. The scout glanced back at her, his eyes scanning the vast expanse of wilderness. "We move fast," he said, his voice low and steady. "The outlaws are close, and we don't have much time." Clara nodded, urging her horse forward. The landscape around them was a mix of dense forests and open plains, with the distant peaks of the Black Hills rising up like jagged sentinels. The scout led the way, his horse moving with practiced ease, while Clara followed closely behind, her thoughts consumed by the image of her son's frightened face. They rode for hours, the sun climbing higher in the sky, but the scout never slowed. His eyes were sharp, constantly scanning the surroundings. Clara tried to keep up, but the weight of her fear made every second feel like an eternity. She had never ventured this far into the wilderness, and the vastness of it all was overwhelming. They stopped for a brief moment to catch their breath, and the scout dismounted to examine the ground. Clara watched as he crouched low, his fingers brushing over the earth as if reading the land itself. "They've passed this way," he muttered, his face unreadable. "Not far ahead. They'll be holed up in a canyon, probably waiting for nightfall before they make their next move." Clara's heart raced at the thought of her son being so close, and she felt a surge of determination wash over her. "Then we go now," she said, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her insides. The scout didn't argue. He mounted his horse again, and Clara followed suit. They pressed on, moving faster now, with the sun high in the sky and the wind at their backs. The terrain grew more rugged, and Clara's horse struggled to keep pace, but the scout remained undeterred. The sound of hooves echoed through the canyon walls as they neared the hideout. Clara's stomach twisted in knots. She had no plan, no idea how she would confront the outlaws, but one thing was clear: she couldn't stop now. As they neared the entrance to the canyon, the scout held up his hand, signaling for them to stop. He dismounted once more, his eyes scanning the narrow opening between the rock walls. "This is it," he whispered. "Stay close and follow my lead. We'll get him back, I promise." Clara's heart pounded in her chest as she dismounted, her legs weak beneath her. The thought of facing the outlaws terrified her, but the thought of losing her son forever was even worse. The scout motioned for her to follow him as he slipped into the canyon, moving with the stealth of a shadow. Clara followed closely, her breath shallow and quick. The canyon walls rose high above them, casting deep shadows that made it difficult to see. But the scout seemed to know exactly where he was going, his movements swift and confident. They moved deeper into the canyon, the sound of rushing water nearby marking their progress. Clara's thoughts were a blur. She could barely focus on the surroundings, her mind consumed with the need to find her son. Every step felt like it might be their last, and every sound made her jump. As they rounded a bend in the canyon, Clara's eyes widened. Ahead of them, she saw a campfire, its flames flickering in the darkened canyon. Around it, a group of outlaws sat, laughing and talking loudly. Clara's stomach dropped. There, in the center of the camp, was her son. He was sitting on the ground, his hands bound, but he was alive. The sight of him made Clara's heart swell with relief, but it was quickly followed by a wave of fury. These men had dared to hurt him, to take him from her, and she wouldn't let them get away with it. The scout placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip firm but reassuring. "We wait for the right moment," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Clara nodded, her heart racing as they crouched low, hidden behind a cluster of rocks. The outlaws were unaware of their presence, and Clara knew this was their only chance. She had no idea what would happen next, but she knew one thing for sure: she would do whatever it took to bring her son home. The scout's hand remained firmly on Clara's shoulder, his presence a quiet reassurance as they crouched behind the rocks, hidden in the shadows of the canyon. Her heart raced, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps as she watched the outlaws around the campfire. They were laughing, talking, unaware of the danger closing in on them. Her son sat in the center of the group, his hands bound tightly, his head lowered as though he had given up hope. Clara's eyes stung with tears, but she forced them back. She couldn't afford to be weak now. The scout's voice was barely audible, but his words held steady authority. "Stay low, wait for my signal," he whispered. "We strike fast, before they know what's happening." Clara nodded, barely trusting herself to speak. Every fiber of her being screamed to rush in, to pull her son away from these monsters who had dared to harm him, but she knew the scout was right. A hasty attack could end in disaster. They needed precision, a well-timed strike that would give them the upper hand. The outlaws continued to laugh, their loud voices carrying through the canyon. Clara clenched her fists, the sound of their amusement cutting deep. How could they be so careless, so confident in their cruelty? How could they sit there, as if nothing was wrong, while her son was suffering right in front of them? The scout moved silently beside her, his eyes scanning the camp with practiced precision. Clara barely breathed, watching him as he studied their surroundings. His movements were fluid, calm, almost as though he had done this 100 times before. The moment came, and Clara barely had time to process it before the scout moved. He sprang from behind the rocks with the speed and grace of a predator, his body low to the ground, his movements fluid and deliberate. Clara followed, her heart in her throat, her feet moving before her mind could catch up. They moved as one, in perfect unison. The scout's bow was drawn in an instant, an arrow whistling through the air and striking one of the outlaws in the chest before he had time to react. The man crumpled to the ground, his body twitching in its final moments. The other outlaws shouted in surprise, reaching for their guns, but it was too late. Clara's heart raced as she moved, adrenaline pumping through her veins. She reached her son in a blur of motion, her hands trembling as she worked to untie the ropes around his wrists. The scout moved swiftly, taking down 2 more of the outlaws with well-placed arrows before they even had time to draw their weapons. It was a blur of chaos, the sounds of shouts and gunfire filling the air, but Clara's focus remained entirely on her son. His eyes met hers, wide with fear, but there was a flicker of recognition there too, a spark of hope. "Mom," he whispered, his voice trembling. Clara's hands moved quickly, her fingers working to free him from his restraints. "I'm here, sweetheart," she whispered back, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm here. You're safe now." As she finished untying the last of the ropes, she pulled her son into her arms, holding him tightly against her chest. He clung to her, his small body shaking with the aftershocks of fear, but Clara's presence was a balm to his broken spirit. She kissed the top of his head, whispering promises of safety and love. "We're going to get out of here," she said softly. "I'm not letting anyone take you away from me again." The scout was already on the move, taking down the last of the outlaws with precision and skill. He moved like a shadow, never staying in one place for too long, always a step ahead of his enemies. Clara could hear the rapid thump of her own heartbeat in her ears, but she remained focused on her son. They were so close now, so close to freedom. The last outlaw fell, and the scout turned toward them, his face a mask of calm. "Let's go," he said, his voice a low growl. "We don't have much time." Clara nodded, lifting her son into her arms. Together, they moved quickly through the canyon, retracing the scout's steps as they made their way toward safety. The sound of the outlaws' campfire grew fainter as they pressed on, but Clara's heart was still pounding in her chest. They weren't out of danger yet. They needed to keep moving, to stay ahead of anyone who might come looking for them. As they made their way through the winding paths of the canyon, Clara couldn't help but feel a sense of relief wash over her. They had done it. They had fought back, taken control, and she had her son in her arms again. The scout led them to a hidden trail, one that wound through the thick brush and over the hills. The path was narrow, but it was their only chance. They would have to move fast, but for the first time since this nightmare had started, Clara felt a sense of hope. They were going to make it. And as they climbed higher into the hills, Clara knew one thing for sure. They would never be separated again. They had been riding for what felt like hours, the sun hanging low in the sky, casting long shadows over the rugged terrain. Clara's heart was still racing from the chaos of the canyon, but with each passing moment, she felt a sense of calm beginning to settle over her. Her son, safely tucked into her arms, had finally fallen asleep, exhausted from the fear and tension of the last few days. The Bone Trail scout, ever vigilant, led the way, his eyes scanning the path ahead, his every movement calculated and precise. Clara couldn't help but feel grateful for the scout's presence. In a world that had shown her nothing but cruelty, he had been her protector, the one steady hand guiding her through the storm. As they made their way through the narrow mountain pass, Clara's thoughts drifted back to her life before all of this. She had once known peace, the comfort of a family home, and a future that seemed full of possibility. But all of that had been ripped away when her father's debts caught up with her. The weight of those debts had fallen on her, and now, it seemed, her son was paying the price. She clenched her jaw, pushing away the bitter taste of helplessness. She would not let her son suffer any longer. She would fight for him, no matter what. As they reached the crest of the hill, the scout halted, raising his hand to signal for them to stop. Clara pulled her horse up beside him, her heart pounding once more as she waited for his next move. He dismounted swiftly, his eyes narrowing as he surveyed the landscape below. The valley stretched out before them, a vast expanse of rocky terrain and scattered patches of sparse vegetation. It was a beautiful, desolate place, but it was also a dangerous one, and Clara could feel the tension building once again. "They're close," the scout muttered under his breath, his voice low and steady. Clara's pulse quickened. "Who?" she asked, her voice tight. The scout didn't need to answer. Clara saw the movement first, a group of figures riding toward the valley, their dark silhouettes standing out against the fading light. She recognized them immediately. It was the outlaws. They had found them. Clara's blood ran cold as she realized they were not alone. The group was larger than she had anticipated, and they were armed, their rifles slung across their backs as they rode. The scout's eyes flicked to her, his expression unreadable. "We need to move," he said quickly. "Now." Clara's heart sank. She had no idea what the scout was planning, but there was no time to waste. The outlaws were closing in fast, and they were riding straight toward them. "Where do we go?" Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Down into the valley," the scout replied. "We'll make our stand there. It's the only chance we've got." Clara nodded, her hands shaking as she urged her horse forward. The scout led the way, his movements swift and fluid, his horse galloping across the rocky terrain with ease. Clara followed closely, her mind racing. She had no idea what kind of fight they were about to face, but she knew one thing for certain. She would not let her son be taken again. The scout guided them into the valley, the horses' hooves pounding the earth as they moved deeper into the desolate landscape. The outlaws were still coming, their horses kicking up dust as they closed in. Clara's heart thudded in her chest as she drew her gun, her hands steady despite the fear gnawing at her insides. She was ready. As they reached the bottom of the valley, the scout turned sharply, dismounting in one smooth motion. He knelt low, scanning the area around them, his eyes sharp and focused. Clara followed his lead, pulling her son from her horse and setting him down gently on the ground behind a large boulder. "Stay here," she whispered to him, pressing a kiss to his forehead. "Don't move, no matter what." Her son nodded, his wide eyes filled with trust and fear. Clara's heart broke, but she knew she had no choice. She turned back. To the scout, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "What's the plan?" she asked. The scout didn't answer right away. Instead, he moved swiftly, positioning himself behind a rock outcrop, his eyes trained on the approaching outlaws. Clara followed suit, keeping her gun ready as she crouched low. The outlaws were getting closer, their laughter carrying through the valley, but Clara didn't flinch. She would not let them take her son. As the first outlaw came into view, the scout sprang into action, his bowstring snapping as an arrow flew through the air, striking the man square in the chest. The outlaw fell from his horse, dead before he hit the ground. The rest of the group reacted quickly, drawing their weapons and shouting commands. But the scout was already moving, taking down 2 more outlaws before they could even return fire. Clara fired her gun, hitting one of the outlaws in the shoulder, sending him stumbling backward. The battle had begun, and it was a fight to the death. Clara moved with precision, her every shot hitting its mark, while the scout continued to take down their enemies with deadly accuracy. The valley echoed with the sounds of gunfire, the air thick with smoke and the scent of gunpowder. Clara's heart pounded in her chest as she fought, her fear replaced by a fierce determination to protect her son. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the last outlaw fell, his body crumpling to the ground. The scout stood over him, breathing heavily, his eyes scanning the area to ensure there were no more threats. Clara stood frozen, her gun still raised, her mind reeling from the chaos of the battle. It was over. They had won. But at what cost? Clara turned to the scout, her voice barely a whisper. "Thank you," she said, her eyes filled with gratitude. "We did it," he replied simply, his face unreadable. But Clara could see the relief in his eyes. They had won, but the battle was far from over. They still had a long way to go. The scout nodded toward the horizon. "Let's get moving. The sun's going down, and we're not safe yet." Clara nodded, gathering her son into her arms once more. They had survived this fight, but the journey was far from over. The journey had been long, but they could not afford to rest just yet. As Clara carried her son, his small, trembling body clinging to her, she kept her eyes fixed on the scout ahead. The events of the last few days felt like a blur. The attack, the desperate escape, and the fierce fight to reclaim her son. Yet, the reality of their situation was still sinking in. They were not yet safe, and every step forward felt like it could be their last. The scout moved with precision, never pausing to look back, his gaze locked on the narrow trail that led through the thick brush. Clara followed closely, the weight of her son in her arms a constant reminder of what was at stake. She had never imagined her life would come to this, but now, she couldn't afford to dwell on the past. The present demanded all of her attention. "We'll make camp soon," the scout called over his shoulder, his voice calm as always. Clara nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Her throat was tight, and the knot of anxiety that had settled there since the day her son had been taken refused to loosen. As the scout led them further into the dense wilderness, Clara tried to steady her breath, focusing on the task at hand. Their survival depended on it. They needed to find shelter for the night, and they needed to do so quickly. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the landscape. The canyon walls, which had once seemed so intimidating, now offered a measure of protection from the growing darkness. The scout was right. Camp was their best option for now. They could rest, regroup, and plan their next move. As the sky darkened, the sound of the scout's horse's hooves grew softer. He stopped at the mouth of a small cave, a natural shelter that had clearly been used before. "We'll stay here for the night," he said, dismounting swiftly and tying his horse to a nearby tree. Clara followed suit, setting her son down carefully on a bed of grass she had gathered from nearby. The scout moved efficiently, lighting a small fire with the materials he had gathered from the surrounding area. The flames flickered, casting an orange glow across the cave walls, and Clara watched as the scout worked. She felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for this stranger who had risked everything to help her. Without him, her son would still be in the hands of those outlaws, and Clara would have had no chance of saving him. She knew she owed him more than she could ever repay. As the fire grew, Clara sat beside her son, holding him close as he slowly drifted off to sleep. The weight of the day had finally taken its toll on him, and Clara felt a surge of protectiveness as she stroked his hair. She glanced over at the scout, who was sitting a few feet away, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. He was ever watchful, as if he were expecting an attack at any moment. Clara knew the danger wasn't over. They had made it this far, but the outlaws were still out there. She couldn't afford to let her guard down. As the night wore on, the silence of the wilderness was broken only by the occasional crackle of the fire and the distant calls of nocturnal animals. Clara stayed close to her son, keeping her thoughts to herself. She had so many questions, so many things she wanted to ask the scout, but she didn't know where to begin. How had he known they needed help? What had driven him to risk everything to save them? She opened her mouth to speak, but hesitated, unsure of how to express the gratitude she felt. Before she could say anything, the scout spoke, his voice calm and steady. "We've made it this far," he said, glancing over at her. "But we still have a long way to go." Clara nodded, understanding the weight of his words. They had made it through the first part of their journey, but the road ahead would be even harder. The outlaws would not stop looking for them. They would keep coming, and Clara knew they had to stay one step ahead. "What happens next?" Clara asked softly, finally finding her voice. The scout turned his gaze back to the fire, his expression unreadable. "We move at first light," he replied. "We'll make our way north, toward the high plains. There's a settlement there. It's the safest place we can go." Clara's heart lifted at the thought of a safe haven, but she knew better than to get her hopes up too quickly. Safety was a rare thing these days, and she couldn't afford to be complacent. As the night wore on, Clara drifted into a restless sleep, the crackling of the fire and the sound of her son's breathing the only comfort in the stillness. The scout kept watch, never letting his guard down, his sharp eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of danger. The hours passed slowly, but eventually, the first light of morning began to creep across the sky. Clara awoke, her body stiff from the uncomfortable ground, but her mind was sharp. Today was another day of survival, and they couldn't afford to waste any time. The scout stood, his movements efficient as he packed their belongings. Clara helped her son to his feet, and together, they gathered their things, preparing to leave their temporary refuge behind. As they mounted their horses, the scout looked back at her, his expression serious. "We move quickly," he said. "Stay close, and keep your head down. We're not out of danger yet." Clara nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle in her chest. They had made it this far, but the road ahead was filled with uncertainty. They would have to fight every step of the way. But for now, Clara was ready. With the scout by her side, she had hope. Hope that they could survive, hope that they could find safety, and hope that she could finally bring her son home. The sun had barely risen, casting a faint glow across the hills as Clara and the scout rode swiftly through the open plains. The air was crisp and cool, the faint scent of pine and earth mixing with the dust kicked up by their horses. Clara kept her son close, his small body still exhausted from the night's journey, but there was a determination in her eyes now that hadn't been there before. The battle was not over, and every mile they covered brought them closer to safety, but it also brought new dangers. She was no longer just running away. She was fighting for her son's life, and nothing was going to stand in her way. The scout rode ahead, his eyes scanning the terrain with practiced precision. He had been leading them through this land for days, each step taken with a quiet confidence that Clara admired. He had saved them more than once already, and she trusted him implicitly, though she could sense that his mind was constantly at work, calculating their next move. "We'll reach the settlement by nightfall," the scout said, breaking the silence that had settled between them. His voice was steady, as always, but Clara could hear the underlying urgency in his words. They were getting close to their destination, but the road ahead was still fraught with peril. Clara nodded, pushing her horse to move faster. The scout had promised safety, but she knew better than to take anything for granted. After everything they had been through, nothing was certain. As the day wore on, the terrain began to change. The flat plains gradually gave way to rolling hills, dotted with sparse trees and scattered rocks. The air grew warmer, the sun climbing higher in the sky, but Clara barely noticed the heat. She had grown accustomed to it, the relentless struggle of survival driving her forward. Every now and then, she glanced at her son, who had fallen asleep again, his head resting against her chest. His steady breathing was a small comfort in the midst of all the uncertainty. For a moment, Clara allowed herself to imagine a life where she and her son could live in peace, free from fear. A life where they could build a future without constantly looking over their shoulders. But that dream seemed far away, almost impossible. The sound of hooves broke through her thoughts, and Clara's attention snapped back to the present. The scout had stopped, his horse's ears flicking forward as he listened to the wind. Clara's heart skipped a beat as she pulled her horse to a halt beside him. Something was wrong. "Stay here," the scout whispered, his voice barely audible. Clara's chest tightened as she watched him dismount and move swiftly through the tall grass. He was like a shadow, his movements smooth and silent. Clara waited, every muscle in her body tensed, her eyes darting over the landscape. She had learned long ago to trust her instincts, and right now, they were telling her that danger was near. The scout returned a few moments later, his face grim. "We're being followed," he said, his voice low but urgent. Clara's stomach dropped. She had known it was only a matter of time before the outlaws caught up with them. She had hoped they might have been able to slip away undetected, but now it was clear they were not that lucky. "How many?" she asked, her voice trembling despite her efforts to stay calm. The scout paused for a moment, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon. "At least 3, maybe more. They're not far behind." Clara's breath caught in her throat. She glanced at her son, still asleep, and a wave of protectiveness washed over her. They couldn't let them catch up. They couldn't let them take him again. The scout's voice cut through her thoughts. "We need to move quickly. Head toward the ridge. It's our best chance to make it to the settlement without being ambushed." Clara nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She had no choice but to trust the scout. They couldn't stay here. They couldn't afford to be caught off guard. Without another word, they spurred their horses into motion, racing toward the ridge that loomed ahead. The sound of pursuit was faint at first, but Clara knew it was only a matter of time before the outlaws closed in on them. Her mind raced as they galloped over the uneven ground, the wind whipping through her hair. She could hear the scout's horse ahead of her, the steady rhythm of hooves pushing them both forward. Every step felt like a lifetime, every second fraught with tension. The ridge grew closer, the rocky outcroppings casting long shadows across the landscape. The scout's eyes were fixed ahead, his jaw set in determination. He knew they couldn't afford to stop. Clara urged her horse forward, pushing herself harder as the ridge loomed larger in front of them. The sound of hooves behind them grew louder, closer. The outlaws were gaining ground. Clara's breath came in short gasps as they reached the base of the ridge. She could see the scout now, already moving toward the rocky cliffs above. They needed to climb, to gain the high ground before the outlaws could close in. Clara's heart hammered in her chest as she followed, her hands gripping the reins tightly. She could hear the outlaws now, their voices carrying on the wind. "We've got them," one of them shouted. "Don't let them get away." Clara pushed herself harder, her legs aching as they climbed the ridge. Her son, still cradled in her arms, stirred slightly but remained asleep. She couldn't let him wake up to this. She couldn't let him see the danger they were in. At the top of the ridge, the scout turned, his eyes scanning the area. Clara reached the summit moments later, her breath ragged as she dismounted and moved to his side. "We've got to keep going," the scout said, his voice low but urgent. "They're almost here." Clara nodded, her chest tightening as she looked around. The ridge offered a good vantage point, but they couldn't stay here forever. They needed to keep moving. They had to reach the settlement before the outlaws caught up with them. "This way," the scout said, pointing toward a narrow path that wound through the cliffs. Clara followed without hesitation. She had no other choice. The journey was far from over, but with each step, she was closer to safety. She could feel it. Freedom was within reach, and she wasn't going to stop until she had it. The wind howled through the narrow path as Clara and the scout pressed on, climbing higher into the rocky cliffs that marked the edge of the valley. The sun had begun to dip lower, casting long, stretching shadows across the terrain. The sense of urgency was palpable, and Clara's heart raced as they moved swiftly, her son still in her arms, clinging to her tightly. She could feel his small body shivering from the fear and exhaustion of the journey, but he was a quiet presence, trusting her completely. Clara's mind raced, her thoughts consumed by the danger that was closing in on them. The outlaws were still behind them, but they had been gaining ground, and she knew that they couldn't afford to slow down. The scout had given them a brief moment of safety on the ridge, but now they had to keep moving, keep pushing forward, or they would be caught. "Stay close," the scout said, his voice low, barely audible over the wind. Clara nodded, tightening her grip on her son as they continued up the path. The scout had become more than just a guide. He was their lifeline, the only thing standing between them and the chaos that awaited below. Clara could hear the sound of hooves growing louder in the distance, and the realization hit her, there was no more time. "How much further?" she asked, her voice tight with worry. The scout didn't answer right away, but his sharp gaze flicked ahead as he assessed the situation. "Not far. Now," he said after a moment, his voice steady despite the tension. "We'll make it to a place where they won't find us." Clara tried to focus on his words, but the growing sound of pursuit sent a chill down her spine. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, each beat louder than the last. The ridge that they had climbed seemed to narrow as they moved higher, and Clara's eyes darted nervously around. The rock formations above them were jagged, looming, and the path was treacherous. The thought of slipping, of falling, was a constant fear that tugged at her mind. But they had no choice. They had to keep going. They had to trust that the scout knew what he was doing. As they reached a particularly steep section of the path, the scout paused, turning to face Clara. "I need you to go first," he said, his eyes locking onto hers. "It's safer that way." Clara swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his words. She wanted to argue, to say that it was too dangerous, but she didn't. She trusted him, and if this was what needed to be done, then she would do it. Without another word, she carefully stepped forward, making her way up the last stretch of the rocky climb. Her hands were sweaty, her legs shaking from the effort, but she kept her focus, taking each step carefully. She could hear the scout behind her, keeping pace, his movements silent and efficient. As they reached the top, Clara looked around, her breath catching in her throat. The view before them was breathtaking. Below, the valley stretched out in all its wild, untamed beauty. The settlement the scout had mentioned was still miles away, but it felt like they were so close now, so close to the safety they had been fighting for. But the danger was still there. The outlaws were not far behind, and if they reached the top before Clara and the scout had time to escape, they would be trapped. Clara glanced over her shoulder, her eyes scanning the path behind them, but she saw nothing yet. The wind had died down slightly, and the world felt oddly still. The calm before the storm. The scout stepped up beside her, his hand resting on his weapon, his eyes sharp as ever. "We've got to move fast," he said, his voice low and tense. "They're closing in. It won't be long before they find this path." Clara nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. She felt as though they were teetering on the edge of something, a precipice that could either lead them to safety or pull them into disaster. "How do we stop them?" Clara asked, her voice hoarse. The scout didn't look at her, his gaze still fixed on the landscape before them. "We don't stop them," he said flatly. "We outrun them. We head west. There's a pass through the mountains. It's the only chance we have." Clara nodded, though doubt lingered in her mind. She had never been good at running. It wasn't in her nature to flee. But she couldn't afford to think about that now. Her son needed her, and there was no turning back. Without another word, they began to move again, their horses galloping swiftly across the uneven ground. Clara held her son tightly, her grip firm but gentle, and focused on the path ahead. The mountains loomed before them, stark and intimidating, but Clara didn't flinch. She had come this far, and she wasn't about to give up now. The sounds of the outlaws' pursuit were closer now, their shouts carrying on the wind. Clara's pulse quickened, but the scout didn't falter. He kept moving, his movements like clockwork, his body a silent force of nature. The ground beneath them began to rise as they ascended the mountain pass, and Clara could feel the burn in her legs. Every step felt harder than the last, but she couldn't stop. She couldn't afford to. The ridge seemed to stretch on forever, and Clara's eyes began to blur with fatigue, but she kept going, pushing through the pain. The scout's silhouette was a steady presence ahead of her, and she focused on him, on the hope that he was leading them to safety. It felt like hours had passed when they finally reached the narrow opening that marked the beginning of the pass. The scout dismounted and turned to Clara, his face serious. "This is it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We make it through here, we'll have a shot." Clara nodded, feeling a surge of hope despite the exhaustion. They had made it this far. They were almost there. The outlaws were still behind them, but for the first time in what felt like forever, Clara believed that they might actually escape. She stepped forward, her feet dragging as she entered the pass, her heart pounding in her chest. There was no turning back now. Clara's breath came in ragged gasps as she navigated the narrow mountain pass, her heart hammering in her chest. The sounds of the outlaws, their curses and shouts growing fainter behind them, had become a distant echo, but Clara knew better than to think they were safe just yet. The scout was ahead, moving with quiet precision, his gaze constantly scanning the cliffs around them, his every step sure and calculated. Clara followed closely, her son still clutched tightly in her arms, his small head resting against her chest. The weight of him was both comforting and a reminder of the precious life she was fighting for. The mountain pass was a treacherous path, one that twisted and turned in unexpected ways. The narrow, jagged rocks scraped against Clara's legs as they moved deeper into the pass. The air was thin, and with each step, Clara could feel the exhaustion creeping into her bones, but she pushed it aside. She couldn't stop now. They were too close to safety. The ridge above them loomed ominously, its jagged edges casting dark shadows over the rocky terrain. The sun had almost completely set, leaving only a faint glow on the horizon. Clara glanced over at the scout, who was already ahead, making his way up a small incline. He didn't look back, but Clara could see the tension in his movements. He was aware that the outlaws were still out there, somewhere, and he was determined to get them to safety before they could catch up. They moved silently, the only sound the soft shuffle of their boots against the gravel and the occasional snort of the horses. Clara's mind raced as they continued forward. She kept thinking of what might await them at the settlement the scout had mentioned. Was it truly safe? Or was it just another place to hide for a while, always looking over her shoulder? The thought of starting over, of finding a new life for her son in a place where they could finally live without fear, was both terrifying and thrilling. But first, they had to survive this. The sound of hooves, distant but growing louder, snapped Clara out of her thoughts. Her heart skipped a beat, and she glanced quickly at the scout, whose face remained calm but alert. "They're close," he muttered under his breath, barely loud enough for Clara to hear. The sound of the outlaws was unmistakable now, the pounding of hooves, the occasional shouted command. Clara felt her pulse quicken. They were not far behind them. "What do we do?" Clara whispered, her voice barely audible. The scout's eyes flicked back toward her, his expression unreadable. "We move faster," he said simply. Without another word, he urged his horse forward, his figure disappearing into the shadows of the pass. Clara hesitated for a moment, then urged her own horse to follow, her son's small body clinging to her as she rode. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest, but she couldn't stop. She couldn't let the outlaws catch them now. As they pushed forward, Clara's thoughts became a blur. The sharp rocks beneath her horse's hooves, the sound of the outlaws' pursuit growing nearer, and the overwhelming fear for her son's safety consumed her. She didn't know how much longer they could outrun them, but she refused to let them be caught. The scout led them up a narrow incline, and Clara followed closely behind, barely able to keep up. The narrow path was steep, and her horse stumbled several times, but she kept her grip firm on the reins, urging it forward. When they reached the top of the incline, Clara's eyes widened as she saw the narrow ridge ahead. It was a dangerous, exposed path, but it would give them a clear view of anyone coming up behind them. The scout was already ahead, his horse moving with practiced ease, and Clara followed, her mind focused solely on keeping up. They had to make it to the top. As they reached the ridge, the scout turned to face her, his eyes scanning the path below. "We stop here," he said, his voice low but firm. Clara nodded, her chest tight with anxiety. They had reached the high ground, but she knew it wouldn't be enough to guarantee their safety. The outlaws would still be coming. She looked down at her son, who was now wide awake, his wide eyes filled with fear. He had been through so much already. Clara's heart ached at the thought of what he had endured. She would not let them take him again. She wouldn't let anything happen to him. The scout dismounted and tied his horse to a nearby tree, his movements swift and efficient. Clara followed his lead, carefully dismounting and placing her son on the ground beside her. The wind whipped through the pass, sending a chill through Clara's body, but she barely noticed. She kept her eyes trained on the path below, watching for any sign of movement. The outlaws were still coming. She could hear the sound of their hooves growing louder, and Clara's stomach twisted with fear. The scout stood beside her, his hand resting on the hilt of his weapon, his eyes sharp. "We don't have much time," he said, his voice steady. "We need to prepare. We fight here, or we run." Clara's heart raced. She didn't want to fight, but she knew they couldn't afford to run. Not now, not when they were so close. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to calm her racing thoughts. "We fight," she said, her voice unwavering. The scout gave her a quick, approving nod before turning his attention back to the path below. "Stay close," he ordered. "Stay out of sight. We take them by surprise." Clara nodded, her hands shaking slightly as she gripped her weapon. She didn't know how this fight would end, but she knew one thing. She would protect her son, no matter what. The outlaws were almost upon them. This was it, the moment of truth. And Clara was ready. The air was thick with tension as Clara crouched low against the jagged rocks, her heart pounding in her chest. The outlaws were almost upon them, the sound of their hooves growing louder with each passing second. She could feel her son's small, trembling form pressed tightly against her side, and her grip on her weapon tightened. The scout stood beside her, his movements as calm and fluid as always, his sharp eyes scanning the path below. His face was unreadable, but Clara could see the determination in his posture. He had always been prepared for anything, but this was different. This was the moment that would decide their fate. Clara's breath was shallow as she took in their surroundings. The narrow pass they were in offered little cover, and the outlaws would soon have the high ground if they didn't act quickly. She glanced at the scout, their silent communication enough to know they both understood the gravity of the situation. "Stay low," the scout whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. Clara nodded, her body stiff with anticipation. She had never been in a fight like this before, but she knew one thing. She would do whatever it took to protect her son. The first outlaw appeared at the edge of the path, his silhouette barely visible against the fading light. He rode confidently, unaware of the ambush awaiting him. The scout moved first, his bowstring snapping in an instant as an arrow flew silently through the air, striking the outlaw square in the chest. The man fell from his horse without a sound, and the scout quickly disappeared into the shadows, his movements blending seamlessly with the landscape. Clara's breath caught in her throat as the second outlaw came into view. He was moving faster, aware that something was wrong, but it was already too late. Clara raised her gun, steadying her aim as the outlaw passed within range. Her shot rang out, the loud crack of the gun echoing through the pass. The man stumbled, his body jerking as the bullet hit him in the shoulder. He fell from his horse, cursing and clutching at the wound, but Clara didn't hesitate. She moved quickly, darting toward the fallen outlaw, her gun still raised. The scout appeared from the shadows once again, his presence a silent force as he dispatched another outlaw with a quick and deadly strike. The battle was short, but brutal, the outlaws no match for the speed and precision of the scout's attack. Clara's hands were shaking as she watched the last of the men fall, his body crumpling to the ground with a sickening thud. The sounds of the struggle faded into silence, and Clara stood frozen for a moment, her mind reeling. The scout surveyed the area, his eyes scanning for any more threats. After a moment, he turned to Clara, his face stoic, but his eyes softening just a fraction. "It's over," he said simply. Clara nodded, her heart still racing, the adrenaline slowly starting to ebb away. Her son, still clinging to her, looked up at her with wide eyes. She knelt down, pulling him into her arms and pressing her cheek against his. "It's all right now," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "We're safe." But the relief was short-lived. As the scout began to examine the fallen outlaws, Clara's mind began to race. They had won this fight, but the danger was far from over. There were still more outlaws out there, more threats waiting for them down the road. The settlement they were headed toward might be their only hope, but Clara knew better than to trust that safety was guaranteed. They had been lucky this time, but luck could only take them so far. The scout turned to her, his expression unreadable as always, but there was something in his eyes, a hint of concern, perhaps. "We need to move," he said, his voice low and serious. "They'll be looking for us." Clara nodded, her body still tense with the aftershocks of the battle. She gathered her son close, lifting him onto her horse as the scout did the same with his own mount. They moved quickly, retracing their steps through the narrow pass and heading deeper into the mountains. The path ahead was treacherous, but Clara didn't care. They were alive. That was all that mattered. As they rode, Clara glanced over at the scout, his face focused and determined as he led them forward. She didn't know where this journey would end, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a flicker of hope. They had survived this fight. They could survive whatever came next. The settlement was still a long way off, and Clara knew they would face more challenges before they reached it. But for now, they had won. They had kept their heads, fought back when they had to, and lived to see another day. And that, in itself, was victory enough. The sun had almost set completely now, the mountains bathed in the fading light of dusk. The world around them seemed quieter, more peaceful, and Clara allowed herself to take a deep breath, the weight of the day finally beginning to lift. She glanced at her son, still clinging to her, and she whispered a promise to him. "We'll get there," she said softly. "We'll find a way to be safe." She didn't know how long it would take, or what would happen along the way, but she knew one thing. As long as she had her son by her side, she would keep fighting. They had made it this far, and they would make it to the end. Together. The moon had risen high in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the mountain pass as Clara and the scout pressed on. The night was cold, and the wind howled through the narrow gaps in the rocks, but Clara barely noticed the chill. Her mind was fixed on the path ahead. Every step forward was a step closer to safety, to the hope of finding her son's future in a place where they could finally live without fear. Yet the road was far from safe. They had only just begun their journey through the mountains, and Clara knew that danger was still lurking. The outlaws may have been defeated for now, but there were others out there, others who would stop at nothing to claim what they believed was theirs. They had to stay vigilant, stay ahead. The scout led the way, his movements smooth and silent, like a shadow against the night. Clara followed closely, her son wrapped tightly in her arms as they maneuvered through the rugged terrain. The path was steep and narrow, the rocks jagged beneath their horses' hooves, but they couldn't stop. The settlement the scout had mentioned was still a long way off, and Clara's only thought was to keep moving, to reach it before the outlaws, or anyone else, could catch up. They rode in silence, the only sound the soft clip-clop of their horses' hooves against the rocky ground. Clara's eyes darted nervously around the darkened landscape. The moonlight made everything appear stark and ominous, and every shadow seemed to hide an unknown danger. Her thoughts kept returning to the night in the canyon, to the moment when the scout had led them into battle. She had never imagined herself in such a situation, but now that she had fought, had survived, a part of her felt stronger. She would protect her son. She would protect their future. As they reached a small clearing, the scout stopped, raising his hand in a signal for Clara to do the same. He dismounted silently, tying his horse to a nearby tree before turning to Clara. His face was lit only by the pale light of the moon, but his expression was serious. "We need to rest for a while," he said quietly. Clara nodded, her muscles aching from the long ride. She was exhausted, and so was her son. She could feel his small body stiff in her arms, his eyes heavy with sleep. "How far is the settlement now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The scout glanced at the sky, his eyes calculating. "Not far, but we need to be careful. There's a patrol from the settlement that's been hunting down outlaws in these parts. They might be close." Clara's stomach twisted. They couldn't afford to run into anyone, not now. They needed the element of surprise. She set her son down gently, watching him curl up against a rock to sleep. For a moment, she let herself breathe, the weight of the journey, the fear, the exhaustion all threatening to overwhelm her. But she pushed it aside. She had no choice but to keep moving forward. The scout was already scouting the area, his eyes alert as he surveyed the surrounding forest. "Stay here," he said, his voice firm. "I'll check the trail. Stay hidden until I return." Clara nodded, though the urge to follow him was strong. She didn't want to be left alone, not after everything they had been through. But she knew better than to question the scout. He had kept them alive this far. He was their best chance. The minutes felt like hours as Clara sat by her son, her eyes scanning the shadows of the trees, her heart racing with each sound in the distance. She could hear the wind rustling the leaves, the distant call of an owl, but it was the silence that unsettled her. It was too quiet. After what felt like an eternity, the scout returned, his movements swift and deliberate. He didn't speak at first, just nodded in the direction of a narrow path leading deeper into the forest. "It's clear for now," he said, his voice low. "We need to move fast." Clara wasted no time. She gathered her son, lifting him into her arms again as they mounted their horses. The scout led the way, his pace quick but careful. They moved through the forest like shadows, staying to the edges of the trail, always listening, always aware of the world around them. Clara's thoughts continued to race as they rode. The settlement, the hope of safety, it was all so close, yet so far. They had survived the worst of the journey, but Clara knew that survival meant more than just reaching the end. It meant living with the consequences of everything they had endured. It meant building a new life from the ashes of the old one. And that, she realized, was the hardest part. The farther they rode, the more Clara felt the weight of the future pressing down on her. It wasn't just about getting to the settlement. It was about what came after. What would happen when they arrived? What would happen when the scouts there saw her and her son, two strangers with no home, no place to belong? Her stomach twisted at the thought of what awaited them. But she didn't have time to dwell on that now. They were still in danger. The outlaws could still be out there, and even if they made it to the settlement, it wouldn't be the end of their fight. The road ahead was still uncertain. The forest began to thin as they rode, the trees parting to reveal a small, hidden valley below. Clara's eyes brightened as she saw the first signs of the settlement. Small homes nestled against the hills, smoke rising from chimneys, the soft glow of lanterns in the distance. They had made it. Clara felt a rush of relief, but it was quickly tempered by the knowledge that their journey wasn't over. They had reached the edge of safety, but the rest of the battle had yet to be won. The settlement came into view as the trees began to thin out, and Clara's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't the large, bustling town she had imagined, but a small, quiet place nestled between the hills, a place that looked like it could easily be overlooked by the world. Smoke rose from chimneys, and the warm glow of lanterns flickered through the windows of the modest homes that dotted the valley. Clara felt a surge of relief, tempered by the reality that their journey was far from over. The scout, as always, moved with silent precision, his eyes scanning the surroundings as he led them through the final stretch toward the settlement. Clara followed, her son still in her arms, his eyes wide with the exhaustion of the day's journey. But the spark of hope she had not seen for so long had returned in his gaze. They had made it this far. But the question that loomed over Clara's mind was what would happen once they reached the settlement. Would they be welcomed as strangers? Or would they be met with suspicion? Would they be able to find a place to call home? The thought made her stomach tighten. She could feel the weight of her son's small body in her arms, and as she looked down at him, she made a silent promise. No matter what happened, she would protect him. She would keep him safe. As they reached the outskirts of the settlement, the scout stopped, dismounting his horse and turning toward Clara. "Stay close," he said, his voice low and steady. "We don't know how the people here will react. Keep your son quiet, and don't make any sudden moves." Clara nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She had no idea what to expect, but she knew that if they were going to survive, they needed to play it smart. She followed the scout as he moved toward the first of the small homes, the sounds of the settlement growing clearer as they got closer. People moved about, tending to their chores, but there was an air of wariness, a quiet tension in the air that Clara couldn't quite shake. The scout approached a house on the edge of the settlement, a small cabin with a porch that seemed to beckon them. A man stood on the porch, his arms crossed as he surveyed the land around him. His gaze fell on the scout first, and then moved to Clara. His eyes softened slightly when they landed on her son. "What brings you here?" the man asked, his voice rough, but not unkind. The scout stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of his weapon. "We've traveled a long way," he said, his voice calm. "We need shelter for the night. We're not looking for trouble." The man studied them for a moment, his expression unreadable. Clara held her breath, clutching her son tighter, the weight of the moment heavy on her shoulders. "You're lucky to have made it this far," the man said finally, stepping aside. "Come on in. It's not much, but it's safe." Clara exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding and followed the scout as he led the way into the cabin. The interior was small, but warm, with a fire crackling in the hearth and a small table, set with the remains of a simple meal. The man gestured for them to sit, and Clara did so, gently setting her son down beside her. The man did not speak for a moment, but Clara could sense the tension in the room. It was as though he was waiting for something, perhaps for them to explain themselves. Finally, he spoke. "You're not the first to come through here looking for shelter, but you're the first in a long time to make it through the pass." He paused, studying them with an intensity that made Clara uneasy. "What's your story?" Clara glanced at the scout, who nodded slightly, encouraging her to speak. She took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she began to tell her story. She spoke of the outlaws, the debts that had led to her son's capture, and the long journey they had taken to escape. She did not mention the fight, or the bloodshed. She simply told the truth, the way it had happened. The man listened quietly, his expression hard to read. When she finished, there was a long pause before he spoke again. "You've been through a lot," he said quietly, his voice softening. "And I won't pretend to know what it's like. But there's a reason people don't come here anymore." Clara's heart sank. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice tight with fear. The man sighed, leaning back against the wall as he rubbed his hand across his face. "There's something about this place. Something that keeps people away. We used to be a community, a place where people came to find refuge, to start over. But now it's just a place for the lost." Clara looked at him, her heart aching. "We don't want to be lost. We just need somewhere to stay." The man nodded, his eyes softening. "I can offer you that," he said. "But it won't be easy. People here are wary, and there's little enough to go around. You'll have to prove that you belong." Clara nodded, understanding. She had no illusions about what lay ahead. This would not be a sanctuary, it would be a struggle. But for the first time in a long time, she felt a glimmer of hope. "Thank you," she said, her voice full of gratitude. The man gave a small nod, as if accepting her thanks, but there was something in his eyes that warned her. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "You'll have to work for your place here. And the past has a way of catching up with people." Clara didn't know what that meant, but she didn't ask. She just nodded, holding her son close as the fire crackled in the hearth. They were safe, for now. But she knew the road ahead would not be easy. It never was. But they had made it this far. And she would fight with everything she had to keep them safe. Together. The following days in the settlement were filled with uncertainty. Clara had never imagined that finding refuge would be so difficult. The man who had taken them in, a hard-looking figure with little patience for strangers, had been right about one thing. They had to prove they belonged. The people in the settlement were wary, and Clara understood their hesitation. They had no reason to trust anyone, especially someone like her, a woman with a child, a woman with a past. Every day was a battle. Clara woke before dawn and worked alongside the other settlers, learning their ways, helping wherever she could. The land was harsh, the work grueling, but she didn't mind. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt a purpose, a reason to keep going. Her son had settled into a small routine of his own, playing with the other children in the settlement, his laughter a bright spot in the midst of their struggle. It was the only piece of peace Clara had left. But that peace came at a price. As the days went by, Clara grew more and more aware of the tension that hung over the settlement. Whispers of danger reached her ears. It wasn't just the outlaws anymore. There were others, people in the shadows, watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike. Clara had seen it in the eyes of the men in the settlement. They were afraid. Afraid of what would happen if the past caught up with them. She had seen it in the way they glanced over their shoulders, in the way they spoke in hushed tones when they thought no one was listening. They weren't just hiding from outlaws. They were hiding from something darker, something far more dangerous. One afternoon, Clara was working in the small garden beside the cabin, her hands deep in the earth as she planted seeds, when she felt a presence behind her. She straightened, wiping her brow with the back of her hand, and turned to find the scout standing there, his expression unreadable as always. "You need to be careful," he said quietly, his voice low enough that no one else could hear. Clara frowned, wiping the dirt from her hands. "What do you mean?" she asked. The scout glanced around before stepping closer. "I've been watching. People here, they're not who they say they are. You need to watch your back." Clara's stomach twisted at his words. "What do you mean, not who they say they are?" The scout's eyes flicked toward the settlement, his gaze sharp and calculating. "This place has secrets. Things that people don't talk about. The man who took you in, he's not what he seems. None of them are. You need to be careful who you trust." Clara felt a chill run down her spine. She had always known that survival here would come with its own challenges, but now it seemed like the settlement itself was part of the danger. She had no choice but to stay, for her son's sake, but the more she learned about the place, the more she realized how little she truly knew. "What should we do?" she asked, her voice tight with worry. The scout looked at her, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Stay close, keep your son close. Don't let your guard down. Trust no one completely. And if you have to leave, don't wait too long." Clara nodded, her mind racing as she took in his words. She didn't want to believe it. She didn't want to think that this small, quiet place, this place that had become their refuge, was anything but a safe haven. But deep down, she knew the scout was right. They couldn't afford to trust anyone here. She would have to protect her son, no matter what. That night, after the sun had set and the settlement had fallen into its usual eerie quiet, Clara sat by the fire, her son asleep beside her. The warmth of the flames offered little comfort as she stared into the flickering light, her thoughts a storm of uncertainty. The scout's words kept echoing in her mind. They had to leave, but where would they go? The only place she had known was now a place of suspicion, of hidden dangers. The man who had helped them, the man who had shown them kindness, had become a stranger in Clara's eyes. What had he been hiding? What had the others been hiding? It was a dangerous game, one that Clara was not prepared to play, but she had no choice. She would do whatever it took to protect her son. She had no one else. The silence of the settlement was broken by the sound of footsteps outside their cabin. Clara tensed, her heart racing. She glanced toward the door, her hand instinctively moving toward the knife she kept hidden beneath her cloak. The footsteps grew louder, and then stopped. For a moment, everything was still. Clara held her breath, straining to listen, but the silence continued. It wasn't until the door creaked open that Clara's heart skipped a beat. She reached for the knife, ready to defend her son, but the figure that stepped inside wasn't a threat. It was the man from the settlement, the one who had taken them in. His face was shadowed by the night, but there was no mistaking the urgency in his eyes. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low and steady. Clara's grip tightened on the knife, but she didn't move. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man stepped further into the cabin, closing the door quietly behind him. "There's no time," he said. "You need to get out of here. Tonight." Clara's heart raced. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why? What's happening?" The man looked over his shoulder, as if to make sure no one was listening, before lowering his voice even further. "It's not safe. They know who you are. They know what you've been through. And they're coming." Clara's breath caught in her throat. She didn't know who they were, but she knew one thing for sure. They couldn't stay here any longer. The past had caught up with them, and it was only a matter of time before it caught up with everyone else. "Where do we go?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. The man's eyes were filled with regret. "I don't know, but you have to leave. Tonight. Before it's too late." Clara's heart pounded in her chest as the man's words sank in. They had to leave now? The weight of the decision was heavy on her shoulders, but there was no time to hesitate. She looked at her son, still asleep, unaware of the danger that had come creeping into their lives once again. Her eyes flicked to the door, to the small cabin that had provided them with refuge, and she knew that it was no longer safe. The settlement, the people who had taken them in, were no longer a sanctuary. They were a trap, and it was closing in around them. "I'll get my son," Clara said, her voice steady despite the rush of emotions threatening to overtake her. The man nodded, his expression dark, and she moved quickly to scoop her son into her arms. He stirred but didn't wake, his small body still exhausted from the long days of travel and fear. Clara's mind was racing as she moved, pulling together only the bare necessities. Her bag, the few possessions that meant something to her. The man stood by the door, his eyes constantly scanning the settlement beyond. "Hurry," he said. "They'll be here soon. You need to get as far as possible before they find out." Clara's breath hitched in her throat. Who were they? The outlaws? Or something worse? She didn't have time to ask. The man opened the door slowly, making sure no one was watching. The night air was crisp, but Clara barely noticed as she moved toward the trees, the darkness swallowing them whole. They had to move quickly. She could hear the sounds of the settlement behind them, the faint murmur of voices and the occasional clink of metal, but all of it felt distant now. Her world had narrowed to the path ahead, to the only thing that mattered, getting her son out of here. The scout had already disappeared into the shadows, moving silently ahead of them. He had always been the one to take charge, to guide them through the treacherous terrain. Now, it was Clara's turn to lead. She had no other choice. The man who had helped them earlier was still by her side, watching their backs. He hadn't said much more since the warning, but Clara could feel his tension, his urgency. The world felt different now. It felt like they were being hunted, like the ground beneath their feet was shifting, pulling them deeper into danger with every step they took. Clara's thoughts were a blur. She was scared, terrified, but she couldn't let it show. Her son was depending on her, and she couldn't let him see the fear that gripped her heart. She had to stay strong. They walked for what felt like hours, the only sounds the crunch of their footsteps on the dry leaves and the occasional rustle of branches in the wind. The forest around them was dense, the trees standing tall like silent sentinels watching over them. Clara felt the cold bite of the night air, but it was the coldness in her chest that made it hard to breathe. They were running, yes, but for how long? Where would they go? What would they do when they reached the end of the road? The questions swirled in her mind, but she had no answers. The only thing she knew was that they had to keep moving. They couldn't stop. Not yet. The sounds of pursuit were distant but unmistakable. The man had said they'd be coming. The realization hit Clara that their time was running out. They weren't going to make it out without a fight. As if on cue, the scout appeared in the darkness ahead of them, his silhouette barely visible against the night. "This way," he whispered, motioning for Clara to follow. She didn't hesitate, her instincts kicking in as she moved toward him. The path grew narrower, and Clara could feel the weight of the forest pressing in around them, the trees blocking out what little light remained from the moon. Her son stirred again, his eyes fluttering open, and Clara held him close, trying to soothe him with soft words. "It's okay, baby. We're almost there. Just a little longer." She knew it wasn't true. There was no safe place anymore. They had been running for days, and every moment brought them closer to the edge of a cliff they didn't know how to navigate. But she couldn't tell him that. She couldn't tell him the truth. The scout stopped suddenly, his hand raised in a signal for silence. Clara froze, her heart racing in her chest. She held her breath, straining to listen. There, just ahead, the faint sound of voices carried through the trees. Clara's stomach twisted with dread. The outlaws were getting closer. They were hunting them. The scout turned to her, his face tense. "We need to split up," he said, his voice low. "I'll take the left. You head toward the river. It's your best chance." Clara's heart sank. She didn't want to be separated from the scout, from the only person who had kept them alive so far, but she knew he was right. There was no time to argue. She had to trust him. "Take care of him," she said softly, her voice catching in her throat. The scout nodded, his eyes briefly meeting hers before he turned and disappeared into the shadows. Clara's breath caught in her throat as she stepped into the darkness, the weight of the night closing in around her. She moved as quietly as she could, her son still in her arms, her every step careful, measured. The river was close now. She could hear the sound of rushing water ahead, and for a moment, it felt like a lifeline. But even as she neared it, she knew that it was just one more obstacle in their path. The world around them was closing in. They had reached the edge of safety, but the edge was sharp. Clara's heart thundered in her chest as she reached the river's edge, the cold water rushing over her feet. She glanced back, waiting for the scout to reappear, but there was nothing. Only the quiet night and the relentless sound of the river. Clara held her son tightly, whispering a prayer under her breath. They weren't safe yet. They hadn't won. Not yet.